So last week we did a deep dive into Babylon, and Babylon the Great, Babylon. We learned last week that Babylon really get warm in here with all this
Oh my goodness.
nervousness here.
What the heck?
It's all the best.
Oh my gosh.
I love that
Oh.
on television.
I'll cut that part out. No, so
We better get early started.
we learned that really Babylon has two sides to it. There's the physical Babylon, which is the city, which currently is in ruins, but it'll be rebuilt, as we'll find out, and it'll be Satan's home headquarters and the Antichrist headquarters. But there's also another side to Babylon called spiritual Babylon, and we learned that that's represented by all the false religions created by Satan, all the way back through history, back to Genesis. And chapter 17 that we're studying today deals with the destruction of the spiritual Babylon. And we'll see that today. It's the destruction of all the false religions that Satan has created through the years. And it's represented symbolically by a woman who's sitting on several waters. And we'll see that and the meaning of all that on many waters. The woman's symbolic. She represents these false religions and deceptions that's created by Satan. And over the next two chapters, we're going to see the destruction of Babylon, both the spiritual, and we'll see the destruction of the city of Babylon in chapter 18. So, but here's the best part of the whole thing. This is the part I thought was just awesome. God uses Satan to destroy Babylon. I don't know if you caught that or not. God uses Satan and his minions to destroy both spiritual and the city, physical Babylon. And I was talking to Michelle. I said, it's kind of like if you could imagine that you're in a parking lot somewhere and this big gangbangers surround you. They've got clubs and chains and knives and guns, and you're all alone in this parking lot. And you're thinking, well, this is it, I'm dead. The next thing you know, they all turn on each other. God steps in and he makes them turn on each other. And when it's all said and done, they're all laying there dead at your feet and you're untouched. And God made that happen. So that's kind of the whole thing that happens here, and you'll see it. God is so good. It's just as amazing to me. I never feel like I really understand it enough, because if I could understand him, he wouldn't be a very big God. But he is amazing God. So let's get right into our lesson. We read these verses last week, but I want to refresh because this is what we're going to go over in detail. So let's read starting with Revelation 17:1. It says, "Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great prostitute who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed sexual immorality, and with the wine of whose sexual immorality the dwellers on the earth have become drunk.' And he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold, jewels, and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her sexual immorality. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled greatly. But the angel said to me, 'Why do you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and of the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns that carries her. The beast that you saw was and is not, and is about to rise from the bottomless pit and go to destruction. And the dwellers on earth whose names have not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world will marvel to see the beast, because it was and is not and is to come.'" Okay, so now we're going to go back like we do. We're going to break all this down verse by verse, and we'll start with the first 3 verses. Notice the angel introduces the scene in verses 1 and 2 by describing a certain woman. And he calls this woman the great prostitute. Many translations say harlot, the great harlot. But it's the same thing. Again, it's not an actual woman. It's not a real actual woman. It's The woman symbolizes something else. And women are commonly used in Scripture to symbolize religious systems. In the Bible, for instance, Israel is, if you study the Old Testament, you'll see that Israel is called the wife of Jehovah God. You'll see the church in the New Testament is called the bride of Christ. And so women are often used to symbolize religious systems. And in Scripture, false religions and false gods are often referred to as harlots or prostitutes. And so the term prostitute is used here to picture spiritual Babylon, because a prostitute is a perfect presentation or representation of a false religion. How do I say that? Well, because if you think about a harlot or a prostitute, it's an illegitimate counterfeit wife. It's one who gives the illusion of marriage without the substance or the reality. So in that sense, a harlot is a fitting picture of idolatry. It's a false religion, a false relationship with people worshiping a false god rather than covenant with the one true God. Notice the harlot sits on many waters. And the meaning of the waters is explained later in verse 15, but as a preview, these waters represent the multitude of nations and peoples of the world. In other words, all of humanity, all over the world. And so the woman sits on many waters. It suggests that she influences them or dominates them. So for thousands of years, the world has been under the deception of false religion, which finds its source in Babylon, like we studied last week. It all began in the Garden of Eden, and then it went on to the Tower of Babel and all that. So it's the home of Satan. These false religions blind people from seeing the real true God, and they blind people from seeing the true gospel. And false religions seduce many people today, even, whether it's Islam or Hinduism or Mormonism or even the so-called Christian prosperity teachers, easy for you to say, prosperity teachers. They all do the same thing, really. They give you a false sense of security, and they keep you from seeing the real truth, the truth of the gospel, the truth of Jesus, and the one true God. The angel says that the leaders fornicate with her and the peoples become drunk in her immorality. The enemy entices people to engage in false religions for a variety of reasons. Throughout time, world leaders have used religions to control people. And they build a base of power, they enrich themselves, and they control their subjects. They fornicate with the harlot in the sense that they use her for their own pleasure. And they become partners with her to control the people. Then the people become drunk by her immorality. They in a sense, they lose their senses as they come under Satan's influence. Interestingly, false religion is both a stimulant and a sedative at the same time. It stimulates the lust of the flesh for greater power and various lustful desires, but it also sedates the mind. It lulls a person into a spiritual stupor and blinding them from seeing the truth. Paul talked about this in 2 Corinthians. If you look at 2 Corinthians 4:3 and 4, he says, "And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God, little g, of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God." So obviously this God of this world is Satan, and he's blinded the unbelievers so they don't see the truth of the gospel. They just don't see it. And ultimately, the tool he uses is false religion, harlot, Babylon. Now, getting back to our passage, notice in verse 3, John is taken to see this harlot in a new and more mysterious form. He's taken to the desert wilderness, and he sees a woman riding a scarlet beast. And this beast is full of blasphemous names, and it has 7 heads and 10 horns. That's kind of interesting. Does that sound a little familiar to you? A beast with 7 heads and 10 horns? It should kind of feel familiar because it's the same beast that John saw coming up out of the sea to meet Satan back in Revelation 13. Here's what he saw then. It said, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy." So we learned back then, remember who that was a symbol for? That's the Antichrist. That was a symbol. Remember the dragon that was standing on the shore is Satan, and the Antichrist is coming up out of the sea. So the beast is the Antichrist. Now we see the same beast being ridden by Babylon, the harlot. And I'll have more on what that symbolizes later. Notice in verse 4, she holds a golden cup of abominations and immorality. And it's as if she's indulging in these things, that she's enjoying that. In verse 5, we see her name, that this is woman. This woman is Babylon the Great, the mother of all prostitutes. And like we learned last week, Babylon's not just one of many false prostitutes or false religions. She's the source. She's the beginning of it all, of all counterfeits. She's the mother of all false religions. Here's confirmation of what we see throughout the Bible. The source of all false religion is Satan. And it's personalized by his home base, Babylon. In verse 6, John hears that she's drunk on the blood of the saints, which pictures not only the martyrdom of the tribulation saints, but the martyrdom of all believers in Jesus who have died for their faith throughout history. And false religion is Satan's tool to enslave all the world and bringing into all manner of sin, using it to persecute saints. This is Babylon. She's been around since the beginning. She was here long before the Antichrist showed up. And this is who she is. And of course, the world's false religious groups, the worst of the false religious groups are the so-called Christians. They call themselves Christians, but they're actually false teachers. They use Satan uses them to discredit Jesus, and he uses them to discredit the church. They preach a false gospel. They teach that there's many ways to heaven, not just one. They teach that God is here to make us wealthy. He's here to make sure that we get the closest spot at Walmart when we go there, because we're in his favor. They teach that some sins are not really sins at all, and that the Bible is old and outdated and needs to be rewritten. They teach a works-based salvation, that you have to earn your way. You get to heaven by how good you are, and not by God alone. So Satan uses these. I think they're the worst because Satan kind of gives you a little taste of the truth to kind of lure you in, but then he puts the lie in there. And by the time you've heard a little bit of truth, you think, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. And I'll admit, years and years ago when I first was becoming a Christian, one of my favorite preachers was Joel Osteen. Because it's such a positive message, It was uplifting. You go away. He never talked about hell. He never talked about sin. He always talked about how great you were going to feel and how you're going to get that closest spot at Walmart if you're in God's favor. I mean, what a false preacher this guy is. And he's sucked in tens of thousands of people into his web. And he's led by Satan. But anyway, at the end of tribulation, what's going to happen is all these false religions are going to become focused into one person that gets worshipped by everyone, and that's the Antichrist. And that's what's going to happen. We said earlier that the beast is the Antichrist. In verse 8, we see confirmation that this is the Antichrist. He's the one who was, is not, and is about to come out of the abyss to the destruction, referring to his apparent death, resurrection, and then ultimately he's going to be defeated by Jesus in the end. He's also the one the world will see and marvel over and worship. And the beast is being ridden by the harlot, clothed in scarlet and purple and adorned richly. We know that the woman is spiritual Babylon, the mother of all false religion and idolatry. She existed, though, long before the Antichrist ever came along. She's always been around, deceiving people. The fact that we saw her sitting on many waters, which are kings of the earth throughout history. So notice in verse 7, the angel tells John that he will explain to him the meaning of the woman and the horns and the heads of the beast. But first remember that we already learned in chapters 12 and 13, again, I'm going to just reiterate that the dragon is Satan and the beast is the Antichrist. We learned that way back when. And one of those 7 heads is killed and resurrected. So now we get the rest of the story and an explanation of how this ties together. And I'm going to warn you here, this is probably the most complicated passage in all of Revelation, if not in all the Bible. So I'm going to read it to you, and then I would like one of you to come up and explain it to us. Yeah. So let's read it, 17:9 through 11. It says this. This calls for a mind with wisdom. Right away, the angel's saying, hey, this is pretty complicated. This calls for a mind with wisdom. So he says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet come, and when he does come, he'll only remain a little while. As for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7, and it goes to destruction. So who would like to? No hands going up. Okay. I mean, I read that and I said, seriously? I mean, the very first time I read that, I said, God, what are you doing to me here? To have wisdom is the Bible's way of saying that to understand what is being shown in Revelation 17 or else anywhere else in the Bible, you have to know history and you have to know the rest of the Bible, specifically the Old Testament, and you have to have the Holy Spirit to help you interpret it correctly. Because you're not going to get it if you don't have it. This is all going to be gobbledygook. So let's unpack this carefully. Let's look at this. First, notice the 7 heads are called 7 mountains, which is itself symbolic of world rulers. In verse 10, we get confirmation that these 7 mountains are indeed 7 kings. So why did the text go from heads to mountains to kings? Well, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked. What does it mean? Well, the angel is showing us here that these 7 kings are not the same kings who rule with the Antichrist in the last half of tribulation. That's the first place our mind wants to go is, oh, these must be the 7 kings of tribulation. But they're not, and I'll tell you why they're not. These are different kings. When the Bible uses mountains to stand for kings, it means that the kings are the highest authority. No one on earth is higher than this king. So if this king is a mountain, he's the highest ruling authority on earth. And as we all know, in the end of tribulation, Antichrist will be the highest ruling authority on earth, and those kings will be subject. But what happens is these kings are world rulers. That means they don't just rule a country or a territory or Jefferson Parish or anything. They are world rulers over the entire world. And we know only the Antichrist is in the end. The other clue that we notice in verse 9 is that the woman sits on these kings. And we learned earlier that the woman only sits on the king of the whole earth. She doesn't sit on the little king. She sits only on the most powerful. So once the Antichrist rises to power, she sits only on the Antichrist. So she ends up being his person. So if the harlot sits on these kings, they must have ruled before the Antichrist ever came to power. So obviously these kings mentioned here are kings from the past that ruled the whole earth. And in verse 10, we're told that at the time that John penned Revelation, which was about 95 AD, that 5 of these world kings had already fallen. 1 is currently in power, and 1 has not yet come. That's interesting because that right there unlocks the whole mystery. I don't know, how many people have been here since the beginning? Since the beginning of time? No, I mean the beginning of since the beginning of Revelation.
Oh, yeah.
Almost everybody. Way back when, and it was actually, I went back and looked, it was actually starting about in week 12 or so. We got into Daniel, and we spent about a month and a half studying Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Daniel 9. Month and a half to 2. I know you guys are going, I thought this was a study on Revelation. Why are we all up in Daniel here? Well, the reason we did Daniel all those weeks ago is for this passage. I'm going to show you. That's why. We did it for this passage. I should have waited and did it for this passage, but for some reason God had me put it at the beginning. But anyway, so that unlocks the mystery. So clearly we're talking about kings that appear in a sequence over time. So let's put it all together. Let's go back and look at Revelation 13:2 real quick. Notice it says, the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth were like a lion's mouth. And it, let's see, so its feet were like a bear. Its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. So this beast we saw in chapter 13 is the same beast we see here in chapter 17. It's the Antichrist. But notice it has the parts, it has a leopard, it has a bear, and it has a lion. That's the clue to solving this mysterious passage. And you've seen this before in Revelation study because we saw it in Daniel. And remember, the features of this beast are the same features found in Daniel. So as a refresher, let's see if you all remember this. You remember all this? You remember the age of the Gentiles is what Jesus called this age when God sort of puts Israel on hold and he starts dealing with the Gentiles. And it began in 605 BC when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, here we go again with Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar defeated Israel, destroyed Jerusalem, and took all the Israelites captive. That was the beginning. That was the first time that a world ruler had ever defeated Israel completely and took her captive and started persecuting Israel. So that was Babylon. And so we saw that. That was Daniel's dreams that were being prophesied. And we saw that through history. If you go back and look at your history books, all this came true. Babylon was the first, and then Persia defeated Babylon and became the world king, and they were over Jerusalem. And then came the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great and so forth. And all of that came true. So all of his, the Bible prophecy comes true. I don't know how anybody can say the Bible's not real. The Bible prophecy all came true. That was all written thousands of years before it ever happened. So follow with me, we'll get through this. Revelation 17:10 says, "They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other is not yet come, and when he does come, he must remain for only a little while." So if you look at the entire age of the Gentiles, going all the way back to 605 BC, there were 7 world rulers that will be here if you count the 7th at the end, which is the Antichrist. The Antichrist is the final one. So in John's day, when he wrote this book in AD 95, 5 of these kings had already been here and they had all fallen. Keeping in mind these kings are world rulers, they controlled Israel, they persecuted Israel, and they ruled the entire world by defeating their predecessor. So the 5 kings of the world that had already fallen, according to this scripture right here, are as follows. As I said, Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar was the very first to destroy Jerusalem and take Israel. The second was the Persian Empire that came along and defeated Babylon under Cyrus the Great. So Cyrus the Great was the second one. The third one was the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great. They defeated Persia and took over, and they continued to persecute Israel. And Alexander the Great was a young guy, but he died very young. He was only ruled like 3 years, and then he was killed and or died of a disease. So when that happened, the Greek Empire split into 2 kings. So the 4th and the 5th kings that have fallen were a result of Alexander the Great dying at a young age. And the Greek Empire was divided into 2 kings, and that gives us the 4th and 5th kings. According to this passage, 5 kings have already fallen. So there's your 5 kings that have already fallen by the time John wrote Revelation. But then it talks about one is. Who is the one is? Well, that has to be whoever the ruling person is at the time that John penned Revelation. And that would have been Roman Emperor Domitian. He was the Roman Empire, as you know. The Roman Empire was in charge when Jesus was on earth. They were the ones that were persecuting Israel at the time. It was a Roman cross that Jesus was hung on. And when John penned this on the Isle of Patmos, Roman Emperor Domitian was in charge, and the Roman Empire at that time ruled the world. So he was the 5th. He was the one who is. He's the one who is. And then the scripture says, the other one is not yet come. But when he does come, he'll only remain a little while. Who do you think that could be?
China.
China? I love it. Some people say Trump. I think that's what Joe thinks is Trump. No, it's not Trump. No, it's going to be, who do you think is going to come along and be the final world ruler before Christ? It's going to be the Antichrist. That's right. So he's going to be the final guy. Now, verse 11 says something interesting about the Antichrist. It says, as for the beast that was and is not, it is an 8th, but it belongs to the 7th, and it goes to destruction. That's kind of weird. John says it was, it's not. Well, if you think about it, it's apparently talking about Jesus, or Antichrist's death and resurrection, apparent resurrection. So upon being resurrected, the Antichrist is considered an eighth king in the sense that he's the seventh. He dies, he comes back to life and dwelled by Satan, and so he actually becomes the eighth king. So in summary, we have 7 kings who are ruling the world, who have led Satan's kingdom, spiritual Babylon, serving God's purposes of Gentile domination over Israel, going all the way back to 605 BC. And the harlot represents all false religions. So as the harlot rides these various kings throughout all of history, she evidently settles on the Antichrist at the end. And the harlot represents Satan's false religions throughout history. So the kings were her benefactor. And basically she helped the kings maintain control and power over the people. So let's move on here, picking up with verse 12 of Revelation. It says this. Hopefully y'all understand that part that I just did. If not, go back and watch the tape. I probably will, just so I can understand it better. You know. But Revelation 17, 12 through 14 says, "And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour, together with the beast. These are of one mind, and they hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is the Lord of lords, the King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful." There's your spoiler alert. Sorry, I just gave you guys the end of the book, how it ends. So, but now we're back to the 10 horns, which represent the 10 kings of the tribulation. So now we're back talking about the kings that are there with the Antichrist. These kings give their power to the beast, to the Antichrist, but in John's day, they didn't exist yet. So remember the Roman Empire, when it finally crumbled, you know, it crumbled, and the world kind of at that point split into what we have now, which is 195 countries, with really there is no world king right now. And so the final king is going to be the Antichrist. So how are we going to go from 195 countries down to just 10 kings? Well, I think that something really cataclysmic is going to happen that's going to stir things up, and I call that thing the rapture. I think when you take millions of people off the face of the earth, that things are going to be so confusing and disrupted that at that point, people are going to be looking for leadership, and I think it's going to condense down to the 10 kings that we're going to have in the tribulation period. That Bible doesn't say that exactly, but that's kind of what I've been led to believe by what I've read and studied so much.
Joel Osteen taught you that? Joel Osteen taught you that?
Joel Osteen taught me that years ago. But so the only purpose these kings serve is to support God's program to bring the Antichrist to power. It's much easier to control 10 kings than 195 country leaders. So finally, now we understand spiritual Babylon. We see how the judgment comes to her. And that's going to be, we're going to wrap up here pretty quick, so just stick with me. We're almost done. So 17, 15, and 16 says, "And the angel said to me, the waters that you saw where the prostitute is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages." There's our confirmation that that's what that means. "And the 10 horns that you saw, they are the beast. They and the beast will hate the prostitute. They will make her desolate and naked and devour her flesh and burn her up with fire." The 10 horns are the 10 kings. I said that God's going to use Satan and his minions to defeat Babylon. So during the age of the Gentiles, God put Satan counterfeit religious system to work for God's own purposes. How many times have we seen that in the study where God's using Satan and his people to fulfill God's purposes? God's so good. But now God sends the 7th bowl judgment to bring an end to Satan's corrupt counterfeit religious system. Notice in verse 16, we're told the Antichrist and the world rulers under him come to hate the harlot. Well, at mid-tribulation, when Satan indwells the Antichrist, he wants all worship to go to him. He doesn't want anybody else worshiping anywhere else. And so all religious institutions, temples, churches, synagogues, mosques, the Vatican, all these places of worship are no longer needed, and they're destroyed. The Antichrist directs their destruction. and they all get destroyed, burnt to the ground. And these things constitute the flesh of the harlot, and their physical structures and relics that are burned with fire, we're told in verse 16. And all religious institutions are stripped of their wealth. And so she's made desolate and naked. And all of this happens to fulfill God's purposes. Ultimately, it's God who caused Satan to destroy his own pride and joy, is Babylon. And how do I know that? Well, I read the next two verses. Verse 17 says, "For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by being of one mind and handing over their royal power to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman that you saw is the great city that has has dominion over the kings of the earth." And I put in there Babylon. So the angel says in verse 17 that these kings are working to fulfill God's purposes, though they think it's their own. I love how God works. But after the seventh bowl is poured out, the only false religious worship remaining on earth will be the worship of the Antichrist. He'll be the final one that everybody worships. And the Antichrist is really Satan. And so, which has always been the goal of spiritual Babylon anyway, is to entice people to worship Satan instead of God. So now that spiritual Babylon is no more, all that remains of idolatry and false religion is Satan and the Antichrist and the false prophet. Remember we said that's the unholy trinity. You got, Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. Satan is such a counterfeiter. He's always wanting to counterfeit everything that God does. But in verse 14, we're told that Jesus himself will conquer those final three at the end. So the Lord used the seventh judgment to greatly simplify the problem of cleansing the world of false religion. He allowed Satan to do it for him. And so that at his second coming, he only needed to destroy one person, the Antichrist, and end all of idolatry. So, look, I know this was pretty complicated. Like I said, if you need to, go back and watch the video again. I've got it on Facebook, and I went back and actually, if you want to go back and see the lessons we did on Daniel, those are still on Facebook. But they're also in my YouTube channel, which is E. Newton 57, which is my birth year, E. Newton 57. So, October 28th, in case you want to do. But still there, every lesson. That's up to you. You overachievers will probably go back and watch it all. So next week, our attention turns to the physical remnant of Babylon and its impact on the earth. This second judgment of Babylon takes part as a campaign as part of the War of Armageddon. We'll get to see as Satan, as the Antichrist is traveling across over to attack Israel, we'll see that his city gets taken and destroyed while he's going over there. And that really upsets him. But we'll get fully into that next week. But I had some marital advice for the men in the room before we close.
Uh-oh.
And it's this.
I'm glad my wife ain't here.
Never laugh at your wife's choices. You are one of them.